The rain was coming down hard on my windshield while I cried from exhaustion. It was one of those Texas storms that turns the sky a bruised purple and makes the world feel like it is ending. I was sitting in my luxury sedan, parked in the driveway of a house that was too big for one person, gripping the leather steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. The wipers were fighting a losing battle against the deluge, slapping back and forth in a frantic rhythm that matched the pounding of my heart. I was 34 years old. I was the vice president of high-risk lending at Sterling & Vance. I wore suits that cost more than my father's truck, and I had just finished foreclosing on 3 family farms in a single week. I was successful, I was powerful, and sitting there in the dark, listening to the thunder shake the ground, I realized I had absolutely no idea who I was anymore. That moment in the car happened 2 days after the meeting that changed everything. It was the aftershock. But the earthquake itself, the event that cracked the foundation of the fortress I had built around my heart, happened on a Tuesday morning, under the sterile, unforgiving fluorescent lights of the 45th floor. To understand why that day matters, you have to understand the woman I had become. I wasn't born in a high-rise. I grew up in a town where the Friday night football game was the only thing on the calendar and where you knew your neighbor's business before they did. I spent my childhood scraping mud off my boots and dreaming of a place where the air didn't smell like cattle and diesel. I ran away from that life as fast as my scholarship to Wharton could carry me. I traded denim for silk, sweet tea for double espressos, and empathy for efficiency. By the time I landed the corner office in Dallas, I had scrubbed every trace of the country out of my accent and my soul. I viewed the world through spreadsheets. People weren't stories, they were credit scores. Land wasn't heritage, it was collateral. The morning started like any other. My assistant, Sarah, a young girl who was terrified of me, buzzed the intercom. Her voice was trembling slightly, a sound that usually gave me a twisted sense of satisfaction, a confirmation of my status. But today, she sounded confused. She told me there was a man in the lobby. She said he didn't have an appointment. She said he didn't look like he belonged in the building, let alone on the executive floor. I remember sighing, checking my Rolex, and feeling a spike of irritation. I had a lunch meeting with a hedge fund manager in an hour. I didn't have time for walk-ins. I swiveled my chair around and looked through the glass wall of my office. The Sterling & Vance lobby was a masterpiece of intimidation. It was all polished marble, chrome and abstract art that cost millions but made you feel nothing. And there, standing in the middle of that cold grey expanse, was a splash of earth tones that didn't fit. He was standing with his back to me, looking at a sculpture that looked like a twisted piece of metal wreckage. He wore a pair of Wrangler jeans that had been washed so many times they were almost white at the seams. His shirt was a simple plaid button-down, tucked in neat, but it wasn't tailored. It was a working man's shirt. He held a white cowboy hat in his hands, turning it slowly by the brim. It wasn't a costume piece like the ones the oil tycoons wore to the gala dinners. This hat had sweat stains on the band and a shape that had been molded by wind and rain. I watched him for a moment, analyzing him like a predator assesses prey. I saw the scuffed boots, the way he stood with his weight shifted to one leg, calm and patient. In my world, patience was a weakness. It meant you weren't hungry enough. I pressed the intercom button and told Sarah to send him in. I decided I would handle this quickly. I would use my sharpest tone, my biggest words, and I would send him back to whatever dusty town he had crawled out of. I wanted to assert my dominance early in the day. It was a blood sport, and I was the champion. When the heavy glass door opened, he walked in with a slow, deliberate gait. The sound of his boots on the hardwood floor of my office was heavy, rhythmic. He didn't look intimidated. That was the first thing that annoyed me. Most people, when they entered my sanctuary of glass and steel, shrank a little. They tried to make themselves smaller. This man seemed to fill the room, not with noise, but with a quiet gravity. I didn't stand up. I didn't offer my hand. I kept my fingers poised over my keyboard, typing a meaningless email, making him wait those extra 10 seconds that say, "My time is worth more than yours." "Can I help you?" I asked without looking up, my eyes fixed on the screen. "Yes, ma'am, I believe you can," a voice said. It was a soft voice, deep, resonant, and incredibly polite. It had a texture to it, like gravel crunching under tires on a slow Sunday drive. It stopped my typing. I finally looked up. He was older than I expected. The lines around his eyes were deep, etched by years of squinting into the sun. He had a kind face, but there was a steeliness in his blue-green eyes that unsettled me. He didn't look angry. He didn't look desperate. He looked disappointed, though I couldn't figure out why. "I'm here about the Miller property," he said, placing his hat gently on the empty chair opposite my desk. He didn't sit until I gestured for him to do so, a small act of old-school manners that felt alien in this room. The Miller property. I knew it well. It was a mid-sized ranch 3 hours west of here. It had been in the Miller family for 4 generations, but the drought had been brutal for the last 3 years, and the price of feed had skyrocketed. They had missed 3 consecutive payments. According to the algorithm that ruled my life, they were a toxicity in our portfolio. I had signed the foreclosure papers yesterday. Mr. I trailed off, waiting for a name. "Just George," he said. "Well, Mr. George," I said, leaning back in my ergonomic leather chair, crossing my arms. "I assume you're a friend of the family. I have to tell you, unless you are a legal representative, I cannot discuss the details of their account. Privacy laws are very strict." He smiled then, but it wasn't a happy smile. It was a small, crooked lifting of the corner of his mouth. He reached into the front pocket of his shirt and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He smoothed it out on the glass surface of my desk. His hands were rough. I stared at them. They were covered in calluses, the knuckles swollen from work. A stark contrast to the manicured, lotion-softened hands I shook every day. "I have a letter here from Tom Miller authorizing me to speak on his behalf," he said, sliding the paper toward me. "And I'm not just a friend. I'm a neighbor. And where I come from, that means something." I picked up the paper with 2 fingers as if it were contaminated. It was handwritten. The handwriting was shaky. Tom Miller was an old man. I glanced at it, verified the signature, and tossed it back onto the desk. "Okay," I said, my voice dripping with professional boredom. "So you're a neighbor. That's very noble of you. But the reality, sir, is that the Millers are insolvent. The bank has extended them every courtesy. We've restructured twice. The market has shifted. The land is worth more as a subdivision development than it is as a cattle ranch. We have a fiduciary responsibility to our shareholders to recover the asset." I watched him as I spoke, waiting for him to flinch at the jargon. I used words like insolvent and fiduciary as weapons, designed to make people feel stupid, to make them feel like they had wandered into a conversation that was above their pay grade. I wanted him to get angry. I wanted him to shout so I could call security, but he didn't shout. He just looked at me. He looked at the expensive art on my walls, then back at me. "It hasn't rained in 8 months, ma'am," he said quietly. "You can't put rain in a spreadsheet." I let out a short, dry laugh. "No, you can't, which is exactly why agriculture is a high-risk sector. Look, Mr. George, I understand you're emotional about this, but this is a business. Sterling and Vance is an investment bank, not a charity. If the Millers can't pay, they can't stay. It's simple math." He leaned forward slightly. The smell of him reached me then. It wasn't cologne, it was the scent of rain on dust, of leather, of pine. It was the smell of the home I had run away from. It triggered a memory I had buried deep. My father coming home late, smelling just like that, tired but proud. I pushed the memory away violently. "It's not just math," he said. "It's a life." Tom Miller was born in that house. His wife is buried under the oak tree by the creek. You take that land, you don't just take an asset. You erase a history. I stood up then, needing to reassert my height, my position. I walked to the window looking out over the sprawling city of Dallas, the kingdom of concrete and glass. "History doesn't pay the electric bill," I said, my back to him. "And sentimentality is the quickest way to bankruptcy. If you came here to plead for mercy, you're in the wrong building. The church is 3 blocks down. Here, we deal in currency. Unless you have a check for $250,000 in that pocket, we have nothing to discuss." I turned back to face him, expecting defeat. I expected him to pick up his hat and shuffle out, head down, another victim of the modern world. Instead, he was reaching into his shirt pocket again. He pulled out a pen. That's when I noticed the detail. the detail that would haunt me later in the rain. It wasn't a Mont Blanc. It wasn't a gold-plated fountain pen like the one sitting in my crystal holder. It was a cheap yellow plastic pen, the kind you get for free at a feed store. It had the logo of a local grain supply printed on the side in black block letters, worn off from use. He clicked it. Click, click. The sound was loud in the silent office. He pulled a checkbook from his back pocket. It was a long rectangular book, the kind ranchers use, bent to the shape of his body. He opened it and smoothed it flat next to the handwritten letter. "What is the exact figure?" he asked. His voice hadn't changed pitch. It was still steady, calm, like a river that knows exactly where it's going. I blinked. I felt a flush of heat rise up my neck. Was he bluffing? He had to be bluffing. This man, with his scuffed boots and his feed store pen, couldn't possibly have that kind of liquidity. He looked like he fixed his own fences. I sat back down, typing furiously to pull up the payoff quote. I decided to call his bluff. I would give him the number, including the late fees, the legal fees, the early termination penalties. I would give him a number so big it would choke him. $254,322.18, I said, staring him dead in the eye. That's the payoff as of noon today. He didn't flinch. He didn't even look up. He just uncapped that yellow plastic pen and started to write. I watched the ink flow onto the paper. His handwriting was neat, slanted, disciplined. He wrote out the date. He wrote out Sterling and Vance. He wrote out the amount in words, taking his time, making sure every letter was legible. My heart started to beat faster, but not from triumph, from confusion. Who was this man? I looked at his clothes again. Was I missing something? No, everything about him screamed labor. Everything about him screamed dirt poor. But the way he held that cheap pen, there was a dignity in it that made my expensive office feel suddenly very cheap. He finished writing and signed his name at the bottom. He tore the check out of the book with a sharp, crisp sound. He placed the pen back in his pocket and slid the check across the glass desk toward me. "There," he said. "That should cover Tom and Mary for a while." I looked down at the check. My eyes went to the amount first. It was correct. Then my eyes went to the signature. It was a scrawl I had seen 1,000 times, but never on a bank check. I had seen it on album covers in the dusty bins of the record store back home. I had seen it on posters in the window of the local diner. I looked up at him, my mouth suddenly dry, my professional veneer cracking. I started, my voice failing me. He put his finger to his lips, a gentle shushing motion. "Just a neighbor, ma'am. That's all." I looked back at the check. The name printed in the corner wasn't just George, it was George Strait, the king of country music, the man whose voice had been the soundtrack to my parents' lives, to my own childhood before I decided I was too good for it. My mind was reeling. I had just lectured George Strait on finance. I had treated a living legend like a nuisance. I had mocked his clothes, his manners, his values. And he hadn't said a word. He hadn't pulled the "do you know who I am" card. He hadn't demanded to see my boss. He had just sat there with his feed store pen and solved the problem. But the humiliation wasn't over. Not yet. Because just as I was staring at the check, unable to move, the door to my office opened without a knock. It was Mr. Vance, the founder of the firm. He was 82 years old, a man who terrified everyone in the city. He rarely came to the lending floor. He walked with a cane and an entourage of nervous lawyers. "Jason told me there was a disturbance," Mr. Vance barked, his eyes scanning the room. He looked at me, then he looked at the man in the chair. Mr. Vance froze. The scowl dropped from his face instantly, replaced by a look of genuine shock and delight. "George," Mr. Vance said, his voice cracking into a smile. George stood up, taking his hat from the chair. He turned and offered his hand to the old banker. "Hello, Arthur," George said. "Good to see you. I thought I was hallucinating." Mr. Vance, the man who once fired a junior associate for wearing the wrong color tie, was shaking George's hand with both of his, pumping it enthusiastically. "What on earth are you doing here?" Mr. Vance asked. "Why didn't you call my private line?" "Oh, just taking care of some business for a friend," George said easy. "Your vice president here was just helping me sort it out. She's very thorough." He looked at me then. And this is the part that broke me. He could have destroyed me. He could have told Mr. Vance that I was rude, arrogant, dismissive. One word from him, and my career would have been over. Mr. Vance worshipped traditional Texas values, even if he didn't always practice them. If he knew how I had treated George Strait, I would be packing my box within the hour. I held my breath, waiting for the blow. "She's a sharp lady, Arthur," George continued, his blue eyes locking onto mine. "She knows her numbers, just making sure the bank gets its due." He lied for me. He showed me mercy I didn't deserve. Mr. Vance beamed at me. "Good work, Jessica. Good work." George tipped his hat to me. "Ma'am," he said, and then he turned to walk out. But before he reached the door, he stopped. He turned back, reached into his pocket, and pulled out that yellow pen again. He walked back to my desk and set it down gently on top of the check. "You keep that," he said softly, so only I could hear. "Reminds you that sometimes the most important things don't shine like gold." I watched him walk out, the sound of his boots fading down the hallway. I looked at the pen. Hill Country Feed and Supply. It was worth maybe 50 cents. But as I stared at it, blurring through the sudden tears stinging my eyes, it felt heavier than the marble desk it sat on. That was the moment the crack appeared. I sat there for the rest of the afternoon staring at that pen, unable to make another call, unable to foreclose on another family. The silence in my office was deafening. I had won the game of capitalism that day, but I had lost my soul. And a man in a cowboy hat had just handed it back to me, asking me if I wanted to keep it. The silence that followed George Strait's departure was heavier than any noise I had ever heard on a trading floor. My office, usually a sanctuary of high-speed internet and low-frequency humming, felt suddenly like a cage. I sat there for a long time, staring at the yellow pen. Hill Country Feed and Supply. The plastic was scratched. The clicker was a little loose. It was a piece of junk. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to sweep it into the trash. I reached out and touched it. It felt warm, or maybe that was just my imagination projecting the warmth of the man who had left it there. Sarah, my assistant, buzzed in tentatively. "Jessica, the hedge fund managers are waiting in the conference room. You're 10 minutes late." I looked at the intercom. 10 minutes late. In my world, that was a capital offense, but for the first time in 10 years, I didn't care. "Cancel it," I said. "Cancel it?" Sarah's voice squeaked. "But this is the quarter-end review. Mr. Vance will be—" "I said cancel it, Sarah. Tell them I'm indisposed. Tell them I'm sick. I don't care what you tell them." I clicked the intercom off. I stood up and walked to the window. The storm that had been threatening all morning finally broke. The sky turned a violent shade of charcoal, and the rain began to lash against the glass, blurring the city below into a smear of grey and neon. That was the moment from the beginning of my story. That was the drive home. I left the office at 2:00 p.m. I had never left before 8:00 p.m. I took the elevator down to the garage, my heels clicking on the concrete, sounding like gunshots in the empty space. I got into my car, a German sedan that cost more than the house I grew up in. I shut the door, sealing myself inside the smell of expensive leather and new car scent. And then, as the rain hammered the roof, I fell apart. It wasn't a graceful cry, it was ugly. It was the kind of sobbing that racks your ribs and makes you gasp for air. I gripped the steering wheel until my hands shook. I wasn't crying because I was sad. I was crying because I was ashamed. George Strait hadn't just paid a bill. He had held up a mirror. In his quiet, polite way, he had shown me exactly what I had become, a woman who knew the price of everything and the value of nothing. I had treated a legend, a man of immense character, like he was dirt on my shoe simply because he didn't wear a tailored suit. And he had responded with grace. That grace was unbearable. It burned worse than any insult. I drove home in a daze. My house was a sprawling modern mansion in a gated community. It had 5 bedrooms, 6 bathrooms, and 0 life. I walked into the kitchen, poured a glass of wine, and sat at the granite island. I pulled the yellow pen out of my purse. I placed it on the counter. It looked ridiculous there against the imported Italian marble. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his hands, weather-beaten, scarred, strong, signing a check for $250,000 without blinking. I heard his voice. "You can't put rain in a spreadsheet." By morning, the rain had stopped, leaving the air scrubbed clean and raw. I made a decision. I couldn't go back to the bank. Not today. Maybe not ever. But certainly not today. I needed to see it. I needed to see what was worth $250,000 of George Strait's money. I needed to see the Miller place. I traded my pencil skirt for a pair of jeans I hadn't worn in years. I dug a pair of old boots out of the back of my closet. Fashion boots, not work boots, but they would have to do. I got into my car and pointed it west. The drive was a decompression. The city limits of Dallas faded into the rearview mirror, replaced by the endless sprawl of the suburbs, which eventually gave way to the rolling plains of North Texas. The concrete turned to asphalt, and the asphalt turned to chip seal. The deeper I drove into the country, the lighter my chest felt. The landscape opened up, vast and unapologetic. The sky was a piercing blue, the kind you only see after a storm. I rolled the windows down. The air smelled of wet sage, damp earth, and cattle. It was the smell of my childhood, a smell I had spent a lifetime trying to wash off, and now it filled my lungs like oxygen. 3 hours later, I turned onto a gravel road marked by a leaning mailbox that simply said, Miller. The ranch wasn't what I expected. In my files, it was a distressed asset. In my mind, I pictured a ruin. But as I drove up the long, winding driveway, I saw something else. Yes, the fences were old, the wood gray and weathered, but they were mended. The pastures were brown from the drought, but the brush was cleared. The house itself was a modest, single-story ranch style with a wraparound porch. It needed paint, but the flower beds were weeded. It wasn't a ruin. It was a home that was holding on by its fingernails. I parked the car near a rusted tractor. A dog, a three-legged heeler, barked once and then wagged its tail, limping over to sniff my tires. I stepped out, my fancy boots crunching on the gravel. A man came out onto the porch. He was elderly, stooped over, leaning on a cane. He wore overalls and a faded t-shirt. This had to be Tom Miller. "Can I help you, miss?" he called out. His voice was thin, reedy, nothing like the rich baritone of the man who had saved him. I walked up to the porch, feeling like an intruder. "Mr. Miller, my name is Jessica. I'm from the bank." The old man stiffened. His grip on the cane tightened. The welcoming look in his eyes vanished, replaced by a fearful resignation. "The bank," he repeated. "I thought George said he took care of it. He called me yesterday. He said it was done." "It is," I said quickly, raising my hands. "It is done, Mr. Miller. The debt is paid in full. You own this place free and clear. I'm not here to collect anything." He blinked, confused. "Then why are you here?" I paused. Why was I here? To apologize? To absolve myself? "I just wanted to bring you the final paperwork personally. And I wanted to see the place." He studied me for a long moment. He had the same piercing gaze as George, the gaze of men who watch the weather for a living. Finally, he nodded. "Well, come on up then. I just made some iced tea. It's too hot to stand in the sun." I sat on a rocking chair on the porch of the man I had tried to evict 48 hours ago. He handed me a glass of tea in a mason jar. It was sweet, cold, and tasted of lemon and honesty. "For you know," Tom said, looking out over the brown fields, "I was born in that back room. My daddy built this porch. We nearly lost it in the 80s, then again in the 90s. But this drought, this one was the devil." "George, Mr. Strait," I corrected myself. "He seems to care a lot about this land." Tom chuckled, a dry wheezing sound. "George, he don't just care about the land, miss. He cares about the people on it. You know, when my Mary got sick last winter, before she passed, the roads were iced over. Ambulance couldn't get through. George drove his truck across the fields, cut through 3 fences just to get her to the hospital in San Antonio. He sat in the waiting room with me for 12 hours, didn't leave until she was stable. I felt a lump form in my throat. I looked down at my hands. I didn't know that. "No," Tom said softly. "You wouldn't. The bank doesn't have a line for that in their papers, do they?" "No," I whispered. "We don't. He came by yesterday," Tom continued. "After he saw you. He didn't say much about the meeting, just said the lady at the bank was efficient. He handed me the receipt and told me to get some rest. He didn't want to thank you. He never does. He just said, "Tom, we're neighbors, that's what we do. That's what we..." Efficient. The word felt like a slap. George had described me as efficient to the man whose life he had saved. He could have called me heartless. He could have called me a shark. But he protected my dignity, even when I hadn't protected his. "Why?" I asked, looking at Tom. "Why did he do it? That was a lot of money." Tom took a sip of his tea. "Miss, money is just a tool to George, like a hammer or a wrench. You use it to fix things. He saw something broken, my life, and he fixed it. He remembers when he was starting out. He remembers what it's like to worry about the rain. He hasn't forgotten. That's the difference between him and most folks who get big. They climb the ladder and pull it up behind them. George climbs the ladder and throws a rope down." I looked out at the horizon. The sun was beginning to dip, casting long golden shadows across the dry grass. It was beautiful, incredibly, heartbreakingly beautiful. I realized then that I had spent 10 years climbing a ladder that was leaning against the wrong wall. I had been chasing a version of success that was cold and sterile, while real life, messy, painful, communal life, was happening down here in the dirt. "I have the deed here," I said, reaching into my bag. My hand brushed against the yellow pen. I pulled the papers out. "It's all signed. It's yours, Mr. Miller. Forever." He took the papers with trembling hands. He didn't look at them. He looked at me. "Thank you for driving all the way out here, miss. You didn't have to do that." "Yes," I said, my voice barely audible. "I think I did." I stood up to leave. As I walked down the steps, Tom called out, "Miss?" I turned back. "You got a little Texas in your voice," he said, smiling. "I can hear it trying to come out. You from around here?" I froze. I had spent thousands of dollars on voice coaches to erase that accent. I had buried it under layers of corporate polish, but out here, in the quiet, it was resurfacing. "I grew up in Abilene," I admitted. "Abilene," he nodded. "Good people in Abilene. You should visit more often. The city, it makes you forget who you are. The country reminds you." I walked back to my car, my legs feeling heavy. I drove down the gravel road, but instead of turning left toward the highway and Dallas, I turned right. I didn't know where the road went, but I knew I wasn't ready to go back to the glass tower. I drove for miles just watching the land, and then I saw it. A truck parked by a fence line about a mile down the road. A white heavy-duty pickup, dusty and nondescript. A man was standing by the bed of the truck, pouring feed into a trough for a small herd of cattle. I slowed down. My heart hammered against my ribs. It was him. He was wearing a different shirt today, blue instead of plaid, but the hat was the same. The posture was the same. He was working. The king of country music was out here alone, feeding cows on a Wednesday evening. I pulled my car onto the shoulder, about 50 yards away. I didn't want to disturb him. I just wanted to watch. I wanted to understand. He finished pouring the feed and leaned against the truck, wiping his forehead with a handkerchief. He looked up and saw my car. He didn't wave. He just watched me. He stood there, a silhouette against the setting sun, a monument to something I had lost. I rolled down my window. The distance was too great for speech, but the connection was there. I raised my hand, a hesitant small wave. He paused. Then slowly he raised his hand and touched the brim of his hat. A nod, a recognition. Not of the banker, but of the woman from Abilene who was finally finding her way home. I put the car in gear and drove away, tears streaming down my face again. But this time they weren't tears of exhaustion or shame. They were tears of relief. The crack in my armor had shattered the whole shell. I knew, with absolute certainty, that I couldn't go back to Sterling and Vance. I couldn't go back to being the woman who looked at a drought and saw a tax write-off. George Strait had saved Tom Miller's farm with a check, but with a yellow pen and a tip of his hat, he was saving something much more complicated. He was saving me. The resignation letter was 1 sentence long. I typed it on the same keyboard I had used to ruin lives, but this time the keystrokes felt like keys unlocking a prison cell. I walked into Mr. Vance's office the next morning at 8:20 a.m. sharp. I didn't wear the power suit. I wore a simple blouse and slacks. I didn't wear the heels that clicked like gunshots. I wore flats that allowed me to feel the floor beneath my feet. When I handed him the paper, the old man didn't rage. He didn't threaten me with non-compete clauses or talk about wasted potential. He just looked at me over his spectacles, his eyes drifting for a split second to the empty chair where George Strait had sat 2 days prior. "You're going to the other side, aren't you?" Vance asked, his voice gravelly. "I'm going to the side where I can sleep at night, Arthur," I replied. It was the first time I had ever called him by his first name. He nodded slowly, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "George has a habit of waking people up. Just make sure you don't go broke finding your soul, Jessica." I walked out of the Sterling and Vance building with a cardboard box in my hands. It didn't contain awards or plaques. It contained a picture of my parents I had kept face down in a drawer for 5 years, a potted succulent that was half dead, and a yellow plastic pen from Hill Country Feed and Supply. The transition wasn't a fairy tale. Real life rarely is. I didn't move to a ranch and become a cowgirl overnight. That would have been a lie. I was a financier, a creature of numbers, but I realized that numbers could be a shield just as easily as they could be a sword. I sold the mansion in the gated community. I sold the German sedan. I moved into a small rental bungalow in a neighborhood where people actually sat on their porches. With the capital I had saved, I opened a small consultancy firm. My clients weren't hedge funds or developers. My clients were family farms, small business owners, and ranchers facing foreclosure. I became the person they called when the wolves were at the door. I used every trick, every loophole, and every regulation I had learned at the big bank to fight for the little guy. I became the nightmare of my former colleagues. It was hard work. There were months where I barely broke even. There were nights I sat at my kitchen table, a table made of real, knotted pine, staring at stacks of invoices, wondering if I had made a mistake. But then I would reach for that yellow pen. I used it to sign every document. It was my compass. Every time the ink flowed from it, I remembered the man who held it. I remembered that dignity isn't about the balance in your account. It's about keeping your promises. 2 years passed. The drought in Texas finally broke. The reservoirs filled up, the blue bonnets exploded across the highways, and the cattle market stabilized. I received an invitation to a charity gala in San Antonio. It was a fundraiser for rural agricultural relief, a cause that had become my life's work. The invitation said the keynote speaker and performer was George Strait. I almost didn't go. The old shame still lingered in the corners of my mind. I was afraid that if I saw him, he would look at me and see the arrogant banker again. I was afraid that I hadn't changed enough. But I touched the yellow pen in my pocket. I carried it everywhere now, and I felt a surge of courage. The event was held in a massive ballroom, glittering with chandeliers and filled with the elite of Texas society. But the vibe was different from the corporate parties I used to attend. There was warmth here. There was laughter that reached the eyes. I stood near the back of the room as the lights dimmed. When he walked onto the stage, the applause wasn't just polite, it was thunderous. It was love. He wore a tuxedo jacket over his jeans, his hat pristine white under the spotlight. He didn't give a long speech. He just thanked everyone for coming, made a joke about the traffic on I-35, and started to sing. His voice washed over the room, clear and pure as a hill country spring. He sang about rodeos, about love, about heartaches and mornings. I stood in the shadows, letting the music strip away the last remnants of the armor I used to wear. I cried, but this time I wasn't hiding in a car. I was standing tall, surrounded by people, letting the tears fall freely. After the set, the room dissolved into mingling and networking. I knew he would be swarmed by donors and politicians. I decided to leave. I had seen him. That was enough. I made my way through the crowd toward the side exit, trying to slip out unnoticed. I turned a corner into a quiet hallway that led to the loading docks, looking for fresh air. "You're leaving before the dessert." The voice stopped me dead in my tracks. I turned around. He was leaning against the wall, holding a bottle of water. He looked tired, but his eyes were bright. He was alone, flanked by 2 security guards who stood a respectful distance away. "Mr. Strait," I breathed. I didn't want to intrude." He pushed off the wall and took a few slow steps toward me. He squinted slightly, studying my face. "I know you," he said. "You're the lady from the bank, the efficient one." I laughed, a nervous, watery sound. "I used to be. I'm not at the bank anymore." "I heard," he said. "Tom Miller told me. Said you helped his cousin restructure a loan last month. said you fought the bank tooth and nail and saved their tractor. I looked down at my shoes. I just did the math, that's all. No, George said softly. You did more than math. You took a side. He looked at me with that same intense, quiet appraisal he had used in my office years ago. But this time, there was no disappointment in his gaze. There was respect. I still have it, I blurted out. I felt like a child confessing a secret. Have what? I reached into my small clutch purse and pulled out the yellow pen. The logo was almost completely worn off now. The plastic was cracked near the tip. It was the ugliest thing in the ballroom, and to me, it was the most beautiful. You left this on my desk, I said, my voice trembling. That day, you told me it would remind me that the most important things don't shine like gold. George looked at the cheap pen in my hand. He smiled, that crooked, easy smile that had charmed millions, but felt like it was just for me in that moment. Did it work? He asked. It changed my life, I whispered. I quit my job the next day. I went home to Abilene for a while. I remembered who I was. I remembered that I'm a neighbor, not a shark. He nodded slowly, tipping his hat back slightly. Well, that's a powerful thing for a 50-cent pen to do. It wasn't the pen, I said, looking him in the eye. It was the man holding it. You didn't have to be kind to me that day, George. I was awful to you. I judged you. I tried to humiliate you. And you paid $250,000 to save a friend and then treated me with respect I didn't earn. Why? George sighed, looking past me, perhaps thinking of all the miles he had traveled, all the hands he had shaken. Darling, he said, his voice dropping to that low, comforting rumble. We're all just walking each other home. Some of us get lost on the way. Some of us get stuck in the mud. If you're in a truck that can pull someone out, you don't ask how they got stuck. You just throw them a rope. You looked stuck that day. You looked lonelier in that big glass office than Tom Miller ever looked on his empty ranch. The truth of his words hit me in the chest. He had seen through the suit, through the arrogance, right down to the lonely, scared girl from Abilene. Thank you, I said. For the rope. Don't thank me, he said, turning to head back toward the noise of the party. Just keep the pen and keep the gate open for the next person. He walked away, the security guards falling in step behind him. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He had done his work. I walked out into the cool San Antonio night. The sky was clear, studded with stars that looked like diamonds scattered on black velvet. I took a deep breath. The air smelled of jasmine and exhaust, a city smell, but underneath it, I could smell the earth. I walked to my car, a practical 3-year-old SUV with a few dents in the bumper. I sat in the driver's seat and placed the yellow pen on the dashboard. I thought about the hook of my life, that moment in the rain when I cried from exhaustion. I realized now that the rain hadn't been a punishment. It had been a baptism. It washed away the artificial layers so that something real could grow. I started the engine. I had an early meeting the next morning with a young couple who were trying to buy their first feed store. The bank was giving them a hard time about their credit history. They were scared. They needed someone who knew the language of the enemy, but spoke the language of the heart. I put the car in gear. I wasn't the vice president of anything anymore. I wasn't rich, I wasn't powerful in the way the world keeps score. But as I drove onto the highway, merging into the stream of taillights, I felt a peace I had never known in the penthouse. I was Jessica, I was a neighbor, and I had a lot of work to do. The road ahead was long, but for the first time in my life I wasn't driving just to get somewhere. I was driving because I finally liked the person behind the wheel. And on the dashboard, catching the flicker of the passing streetlights, the yellow pen sat steady and true, pointing the way home.